Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Great Exhibition Road Festival here today. We're excited to welcome some of you back to campus and also to our audience online. Thank you so much for joining us. The Great Exhibition Road Festival this year has the theme of One World, where we're exploring how the arts and science can help inspire a greener future. There's talks for all ages all week, a couple here in the weekend, and then throughout the week online as well. This talk is part of our arts and science theme, where we explore individuals or projects who blur the line between arts and science. So my name is Hayley Dunning. I'm your host today. In my day job, I work here at Imperial College London as the media manager for natural sciences, which means I get to write about science. But for the next hour, I will be your presenter, and I'm very thrilled to be talking to Martin, who I'll introduce shortly. Before I do, however, just to let you know, we will be taking questions at the end of this talk, both in person and online. If you're in person, if you have a question when we get to that point, just raise your hand and someone will come over to you with a boom mic. It's a mic on a big long stick so that you don't have to get too close. And if you're online in the YouTube chat, you can pose questions at any time. They'll come through to me here on the iPad and I'll pose them to Martin at the end as well. Just before we get started, just a couple of COVID things for the people in the room. So now that you've come in and sat down, please just stay where you are and stay 1 meter apart from anyone who's not in your household. If you do, keep your masks on as well while you're sat here for the duration of this talk. And when the talk finishes, if you just clear the room quite quickly, just because we have a turnaround for the next talk, so we've got to clean it and all that good stuff. And if you just wash your hands or sanitize on your way out. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to present to you Martin Kishko. He is the UK's Green Poet. He is a poet, but also a composer and screenwriter. He's composed over 200 scores for film and television and released 9 albums with major European orchestras. His screenplays include the children's fantasy Junk World, and now, as we said, he is a green poet. So Martin, you've been doing poetry now for 13 years, but as we said, you started as a composer and a screenwriter. So how did you begin those topics and then move towards poetry?
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to the Imperial College. It's been an incredible journey, really. I grew up on a council estate in South Leeds, and I should have ended up down the pit or in manufacturing or in a factory down the road or something. But by a whole series of accidental things that happened and meeting with very inspiring teacher from the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, and an encouraging father who was interested in music, I started being interested in music and found myself accidentally in further education, although my parents knew nothing about further education. And so I found myself going to uni and all that kind of thing, and I came down to Bristol and met my mentor, a man called Edward Williams, who himself was a composer. And he, at that time, was composing the music for David Attenborough's Life on Earth. And so I got to be his assistant, carrying his coat around, carrying his music score around, just doing odd jobs like that. Learning the nuts and bolts of what it meant to compose music for picture. And I suppose I must have learnt well, because a few years later I went freelance myself as a composer of music for film and television. So that was my route through to quite, as I say, in a sense, quite by chance and quite by luck in many ways, to becoming a composer of film. Worked for the Natural History Unit for many, many years, composing music for anything from lions to monkeys to whatever you see on your wildlife films.
That's amazing. So how did you then decide to go into poetry? Was it these natural history films that inspired you?
Well, I've always written poetry, right through the whole of my life, for life events, things that I've been really concerned about or I felt emotionally attached to, or for people that I had relationships with, or for my children, for my family. And I just think poetry is such an amazing communicator to get across something that you have that is a message and get it across in such a succinct, concise form that the recipient of that message will actually remember and take away with them. It's much easier in the sense of having it in a poem, the structure of a poem, than it is having some turgid kind of explanation about the message you want to communicate. So getting into poetry, really, that I suppose came through the green connections between the Natural History Unit, working for the BBC Natural History Unit for many years, learning a lot about the natural world as I composed music for film. And also, I think, I learned a lot from my father. My father was, he was Polish, and he was brought up in what is now Belarus. And he always used to teach me about the meadows and about the woods and about the creatures. I felt he was very close to the environment. So I guess some of my interest must have come via him too. So that's what kind of motivated me into, when I had the time to concentrate on green issues and stepped back a bit from composing music, that's really what fired me up to start to write environmental poetry.
So tell us a bit more about your Green Poems for a Blue Planet campaign.
Yeah, the Green Poems for Blue Planet campaign, that started about 13 years ago now, 2009. And it was one of these strange moments when I was working on another project, and suddenly, whilst working on that project, the words Green Poems for a Blue Planet flashed into my head, and often you get those things in life, something flashes into your head, and we often go, yeah, that's not of any importance, it'll just go out the other side of our heads and we won't actually need to think about it. But I'm a great believer in when random thoughts come into your mind, to just stop for a minute and grasp them rather than letting them just go out of the other side. And that's what I did with those words, Green Poems for a Blue Planet. I knew that they were going to be important to me in some way. And I wrote them down, and a few weeks later I thought, what I'm going to do is every week for a year, I'm going to write a poem about an environmental issue, because it will teach me about that issue. It'll give me some kind of format and structure to put it down in. And at the end of the year, I had 52 poems, and I happened to forge a relationship just out of the blue with one of the world's greatest scientists, a lady called Dr. Frances Arnold, who has been decorated with virtually every high award for science that you could ever wish to receive, and is a Nobel laureate in chemistry, which she received a few years ago. I didn't know her at all. I was working on a project, self-initiated project about Charles Darwin. I wanted to write an opera, a film opera about Charles Darwin. And I was starting to kind of put some of that together, and I managed to secure the services of Ken Russell, the film director, to direct it. And that would have been some film opera with Ken Russell directing. Anyway, unfortunately, Ken passed, and that project never saw the light of day. But I contacted Frances Arnold and said, I don't know you, I know you're an eminent scientist, but I'm looking for a scientific consultant for my Darwin opera. And surprised one day, an email just came, and it was from her, and she said, Martin, the two things that I really love are Darwin and opera. So, what chance could there be for that? And that just happened again out of the blue. So then I went to the States and decided that because Frances was going to be doing a talk in New York, that I would meet her in New York. And we were sitting having breakfast at a cafe somewhere. And I said, I've spent the year writing these green poems. And I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with them, but I've been teaching myself about environmental issues through poetry. So I said, can I perform some of them for you? So she said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I stood on the sidewalk, performed these poems, and she said, would you like to come to Los Angeles to perform them? So I did. So I went to Los Angeles and I did a performance there, and then came back to the UK, and on the strength of that, tried to get a publisher for the book, which I did, attempted to get an illustrator, which I did. He was my great friend, Nick Park. And I said, many people say to me, how did you get Nick Park, Wallace and Gromit inventor and 4 Oscar winner, to do the illustrations for your book? And I said, well, I just told him that the environment would probably collapse if he didn't do them. So that put a bit of pressure on him, you know, and so I got these wonderful illustrations. And that's how the Green Poems campaign started out. So just from that tiny moment of, I almost feel that the campaign chose me rather than choosing it. And within the first week of the book coming out, I think Nick will remember, Nick and I had to go and do an interview on Blue Peter. And they asked me whether I'd do a little performance as well. So I did that. But I didn't want to do it. I never ever wanted to be on stage. I never wanted to perform, never wanted to be the other side of the camera. So I did the performance, and then that was followed up by one for Radio 4, and then that was followed up by one at the Ilkley Literature Festival, which is a wonderful literature festival. And I finished doing the performance there. I was petrified, absolutely petrified being on stage. Did the performance. Somebody came up to me afterwards from the audience and they said, I really enjoyed the performance. So you must be the UK's green poet then. And so, you know, it was again like something being handed to me. I thought, well, okay, I'll use that. You know, it's a nice moniker to be given by somebody in the audience. And so that's how it's gone on, really. And so when I've done the poetry shows around the world, people refer to me as the UK's green poet. So that's really how it came about.
Great. I mean, what a story. I love how casually you drop in Nobel Prize winners and all these things. Now, your poems, obviously, from there, you've performed them and you kind of have this green idea, and you say that your poems are for Greenies, non-Greenies, and in-betweenies.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by these terms?
Well, I have an opening for the show, which goes a bit like this. I say, you know, are there any Greenies in the audience? So are there any Greenies in the audience today? So that means, are you a Greenie? That means, you know, you carry a bag for life and you don't shoot lions, tigers, monkeys, birds. So are there any Greenies in the audience? Yeah, so Greenies in the audience. So are there any non-Greenies? One just departing through the back door. Are there any in-betweenies? That's people that are not sure what shade of green they actually are. No, okay. So anyway, so I go, welcome, any Greenies, any non-Greenies, any in-betweenies. Welcome those of you that have recycled your Lamborghinis. Welcome those of you toasting your homemade biofuels with a martini. Welcome those of you that are fans of organic green beanies. Welcome those of you hippies with holes in your genies. Welcome those of you cool classic chilled fans of Boccherini, Paganini, Puccini. Welcome those of you that have sold off your Giovanni Bellinis to sustainably invest in your future Bambini. Welcome those of you that are fed up to the back teeth of watching TV reruns of The Sweeney. Welcome those of you that have given up your lattes and your paninis so that you can fit into your boxers and your bikinis. Welcome those of you that have shed pounds of your fettuccine and your linguine to keep your tums teeny and your bums weeny. Welcome those of you green warriors with the heart of an eco-Athene. Welcome those of you who want to see the green genie grant a wish to set the earth free like a Houdini from the exploitation of those naughty non-greenies. You know what I'm meaning? That's the best I can do, rhyming with greenie. So, you know, it's just using a little bit of humour here and there to just ease us into the talks and the shows without feeling that this huge green 50-ton weight is going to drop on your head.
Now, we talked a little bit about being very nervous about performance to start with, but performance is obviously now a very important part of what you do. Why do you think it's important to perform your poems?
Well, this type of poetry is very much, it is performance poetry, isn't it? It has to be out there, and it has to have movement with it in order to get the message across. And that's why, it's important, I think, when we think about getting the green message across, that we look at ways that allow us to just think outside the box a little bit. So that's why I like to do it as a physical performance.
I think we can all see a little bit of the power of that. And thinking about this greenies and in-betweenies, what do you think is the purpose of your poetry? Are you trying to shift people along that spectrum a little bit?
Well, I call myself a seed planter or an elbow nudger. That's all I can do. We can each just contribute a little bit, and hope that we can make a difference along the way. Elbow nudge somebody and say, hey, just have a little think about this, or let me remind you about that. And hope that those elbow nudges kind of go up the scale, and eventually we can elbow nudge people in those big corporate controllers and multinationals and politicians and so on. So that's all I feel that I am contributing as a green poet. And I'm sure that maybe there are poets here as well, or people that like to write, and I believe that we can all do the same, and we can all move the debate, but in that more entertaining way.
Now, you do it with a wide range of subjects. So for those of you who are not familiar with Martin's poems, there's poo power, there's butterfly conferences, butterfly trade unions, I must say, handbags. How do you come up with these ideas and channel them?
I think looking back, I think there was a slide, wasn't there, just back before this one, was it? Yeah, this one I was very concerned about reading about space junk. The hundreds and thousands of, as you know, defunct satellites and bits of astronauts' gloves and bits of their screwdrivers and bits of flecks of paint and floating around in space. So I thought, this would be great to create an abstract poem in this particular format, using the words to do that as well. This is the poem Wikipedia about all the junk that's left behind, has been left behind by mountaineers on Mount Everest. So again, just persuaded me to create an abstract poem using that shape for the text. And likewise with poo power, we've just seen the symbol there for poo power, where I just thought, well, it'd be great to actually find a way that I could show people how they can make energy from their own poo or from animal poo. So just been performing poo power up at the Albert Hall, and there I was explaining that in Bristol, when I was a resident poet in Bristol for the European Green Capital Year, we had buses that were using biogas and running on the number 2 route in Bristol. We really know how to have a laugh in Bristol, and that was just absolutely marvelous. But there are communities around the world, of course, who are dependent on creating their energy from human poo or from animal poo, and so poo power tells us how we can create our own poo from not our own poo, our own energy. We can create our own poo anyway, I'm sure we can, but our own energy from poo.
Fantastic. So that's a bit about where these themes come from. But how do you make a poem? What's the process of turning that into words or performance?
It happens in all sorts of different ways. So I wrote a poem about the journeys that fruit makes across the world. Because I went to the supermarket one day and I was shopping, and I looked on the shelves and I counted all the fruits. And out of all the fruits, I think there were about maybe 30 or 35. And the only one fruit that I could identify that was from the UK. Can you guess what it was? Yeah, it was apples. It was Cox's apples. And the rest of them had all been flown in. So I wrote a poem called Fruit Miles. And I wanted to write it at that particular point that I was in the supermarket. I could see all the fruit. So I happened to have an old receipt, supermarket receipt with me. So I started, putting a rough idea for the poem down on that receipt. So it's moments like that, it's triggers like that that suddenly signal that I should do it. It isn't often that I should just sit down and say, this is a poem I'm going to write, and it's going to be about this particular issue. It's the issue that is often presented to one that I feel signifies that the writing should be done.
Mm-hmm. So you've got a couple of children's books of poems, but you obviously have other projects as well. So tell us a bit about, you've got an epic poem and an eco radio drama.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in epic poetry, you know, the ability to tell a tale like a saga, for instance, over a long time scale, and or talk about or dynasties or whatever. And I've always been interested in for some reason I've always been interested in knights, you know, and castles and all that, and the medieval era. So I decided to write this epic eco poem called King Frank and the Knights of the Ecoquest, and it's about a kingdom that exists, a sort of alternative forgotten kingdom at the end of the world that all the rest of Earth dumps their trash onto. But it itself hasn't moved on from medieval times. It's got all this trash on board, and it is actually polluting its own kingdom as well. But it hasn't moved on from medieval times. Everybody dresses as if they're in medieval times, and they all speak in verse. So there's two versions of the poem. There's this one, I think, which is 9,000 or 10,000 words in rhyming couplets. And then there's I adapted it into a 15-part radio drama for children, which went out on Fun Kids digital channel early on in the year. And that was 25,000 words of rhyming couplets. And in the kingdom, the princess falls ill from drinking dirty water. She tries to get the king to hire 3 knights that will go on an eco quest to find the source of a lost spring that used to have safe, clean water that could be reintroduced to the kingdom. But as the knights go on their quest, they meet lots of climate change obstacles. They meet a river of leachate poo and pee. They meet a stranded polar bear, and they meet the effects of climate change, desertification, for example, and flooding, and so on.
Sounds epic, and not necessarily in the best way, but brilliant. Now, children obviously are important to you in your poems,
yeah.
And you also do workshops, and you've done workshops around the world, the US, UK, but also China, India, places like that. What are those like? Do the children have different approaches in these different places?
Well, I don't think they particularly have different approaches, but it's interesting gauging often the level of enthusiasm. So yeah, this is one of these kind of like working with children in India, and I'm just kind of like fascinated. I mean, I've performed in India about 3 times now, and I just find the children just so enthusiastic. After I do the workshops or performances, they're standing there and they're saying, what else can you tell us about how the planet could be saved? What other environmental things could we do to help the planet? It's absolutely, it's just wonderful. And one of the things that answers to that question, which I think is a difficult one, you know, there's a lot that we are trying to do, but in my opinion, and I guess it is just my opinion, and my answer is, I say to them, you know, do you know what it feels like to love a parent? Do you know what it feels like or if you're a parent, what it is to love a child, or to love a sibling, or to love your partner, or to love your pet? And they all say, yes, we do. I say, well, that is exactly the same emotional connection I believe we should have with our planet. Because without that emotional connection, you know, not much can be done. This is why I love the romantic poets. You know, you take people like for example, Wordsworth that we all know. But the romantic poets, what they did so beautifully is that they could go out into nature, they would talk about nature, they would write about nature, bring it back into the industrialized cities, you know, where people were kind of not really bothered about going out into the countryside, and they would get introduced to the countryside through those poems. You know, and even Wordsworth himself, he wrote a poem called The Tables Turned. And in The Tables Turned, he quite ironically talks about, don't bother with books. Don't bother about learning from books. He says, books, 'tis dull and endless strife. He says, come here, the woodland linnet. How sweet his voice. Upon my life, there's more than wisdom in it. How sweet, come, oh hark, how sweet the throstle sings, he too is no mean preacher. Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. You know, it's really interesting that's got romantic poetry is imbued with that kind of learning. You know, let's put reason aside, let's put logic aside, let's return to nature, let's embed ourselves and envelop ourselves in nature.
That kind of romanticism, is that one of the reasons that you find poetry such a good method for communicating green messages, which can be quite scientific sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, I'm fascinated by the power of poetry to represent, for example, social injustice or to represent our green issues. And when you think about it, you know, you can go back to the ancient Greeks. You know, poetry has just been such a powerful communicator. It's only now, I feel, to some extent, you know, that poetry is getting recognition again that it lost for many, many years, probably since the Liverpool poets came out in the 1960s. But, you know, if you go from the ancient Greeks and you go through to the medieval debating poetry in medieval times, where poets would take subjects of, you know, autumn versus winter, green versus gold, the owl versus the nightingale. And these sorts of debating poems that came around, they kind of spurred on a lot of the debate within the institutions that were growing up at the time, universities, parliament, you know, lawmaking institutions. So poetry was debate, the idea of debate was beginning to creep through. And, you know, you could then jump on, if you like, to, let's say, the Romantic poets, of course, you know, and they are doing exactly what I mentioned earlier on, bringing the idea of nature and kind of introducing that to the general public. Then go forward, if you like, to Victorian times. You have people like a poet called Ella Wheeler Wilcox, who was writing, and she was writing really about slavery and about, you know, the emancipation of slaves. And she had a wonderful, you know, there's a poem that says, laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone. That is Ella Wheeler Wilcox. You know, we all know those two lines, and that is her. But she also said, she has a poem called Protest, and it starts off, to sin by silence makes cowards out of men. Okay? Had no voice been raised against ignorance and injustice, then the Inquisition would still rule the law and guillotines decide our least disputes. So these are poets that are trying to lead the protest movements. You know, going back to Romanticism, you take Shelley, you know, he wrote The Mask of Anarchy, you know, saying all these rich people were controlling, and the royals were controlling society, and the poor were absolutely stamped down and marginalized. And he wrote this poem, The Mask of Anarchy, which was about the 1819 massacre at Peterloo. Jump forwards again, you know, if you like, to the beat poets of the 1950s, 1960s, you know, that were writing about civil disobedience and were part of that civil disobedience movement in the United States. This is all, again, I'm just absolutely amazed by it, you know, and empowered by the fact that you know, the writer Maya Angelou said, poets actually able to, poets are the last people to be still speaking the truth when other people have decided they're going to finish with it. And they're the first people to recognize what the new consciousness is likely to be before anybody has thought about it. Well, you might disagree with that, but again, I think it's a very powerful statement to make. Shelley made it too. Shelley said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That's how boastful Shelley was about it. Again, I think it's marvelous. So you had this whole movement, with the Black Arts movement in the United States, very much a part of that. A group called around 1968, the Last Poets, which was a black group of musicians and poets, very much leading the way. And if you played one of their YouTube videos today, you'd think you'd be watching hip hop from yesterday or from today, because they inspired the whole of the hip hop movement. The Last Poets, take a look at it.
So where do you think you fit into all of this? Obviously, there's some of your activism here.
I'm just doing my bit, aren't I? I believe that poets can empower social movements or lead social movements or help to enhance, people that want to spread the message about social injustice or the green debate. So that's what I'm doing, I'm on the street, I'm on festivals and schools and wherever anybody would like me to do my poetry, I'll be there.
Do you hope that you might also have a long-lasting legacy? Do you think you're part of a community of poets who for now, this is one of the big social issues?
Yeah, I think there are lots more of us about them. When I started off my Green Poems for a Blue Planet campaign in 2009, I think I was pretty much thought of as a bit of a, I can remember presenting my work to lots of people in the media, and lots of people. Do you know what? A lot of people in the media who are now putting work out, and the green message is very much part of their storytelling, part of their narrative. Back in 2009, said we're not interested in you because you've got a message that you're trying to put through normal narrative. Yeah, I'm thinking about, come on. And I was writing at that time about plastics. I was writing about ghost fishing. Nobody else was writing about it at the time. All subjects that started to really concern me. And I thought, well, I can't do anything. I can't go out and try and get all the trawler nets to stop catching turtles and sea creatures and goodness knows what that got entwined in this stuff. But I can write about it. And I can write about it in an entertaining way that will actually give people an eco chuckle, but actually it has got a very, very, very serious content. So, but there are a lot of us around now, eco poets, and there are a lot of certainly, got to be careful. There's a lot of greenwashing around as well. Companies that suddenly we want some green stuff because it makes us look good, it makes us look eco-friendly. But we want to work with, I want to work with people who seriously want to collaborate. I enjoy scientific. I'm the worst scientist in the world. You're talking to somebody who, in physics, when I was at school, came 31st in a class of 31. And my chemistry teacher kept blowing up experiments, so I never learned anything about chemistry. And I didn't even get my maths O level. But I love science. I absolutely love talking about it. I try and learn as much about it as possible. And I try and turn those facts into something palatable for a general audience who doesn't understand anything about those things either. Or they don't understand. I'm talking about audiences who are marginalized, who don't understand what the middle class eco debate is all about, because a lot of the words are just too fancy. And a lot of the Zoom conferences are a lot too fancy. So that's what I feel I can do. I can, I grew up in an immigrant community. I grew up understanding the language of, people living I lived in one of the most deprived communities in Leeds, and I understand how people function, and that's often how I try to write, thinking about writing to that particular audience. It's very important for us not just to be concentrating, on our everybody that we greenly know.
Yeah, it's not preaching to the converted, just to the greenies, right? Trying to shift people along that spectrum. So I know that one of your poems, thinking about your shirt there, kind of covers this theme a bit. You've got a poem about butterflies and moths? Yeah, butterflies. That's because on the council estate I lived on when I was a kid, there were cornfields and meadows and woodland, that hadn't been built on at that time. It's all been built on
now. It's all gone. But I used to like to go out, like you did in those days, 9 o'clock in the morning. Mum and Dad didn't have a phone. In the school holidays, they'd both be working. They'd go, right, see you at 6 o'clock. I used to go out and play all day by myself and with my mates. And I used to love to run, especially in the meadows, lie down in the meadows, look at the sky, chase butterflies, and hope to catch with my net the peacock or the red admiral if I was lucky. And so that's what I did. But I came to realize, when I was writing my poetry a few years ago, that the habitats of butterflies were fast disappearing. So I imagined for this particular poem, it's called The Board of Butterflies at the annual moth meeting, that the butterflies would get together in a kind of a village hall meeting or a town meeting or a trade union style meeting to complain about losing their habitats. So the Board of Butterflies at the annual moth meeting. The high brown fritillary announced the meeting. There are none of us left. We took a real beating. The heathlands and wetlands are being reclaimed. We're now reduced to only our name. Pesticides, chemicals. What shall we do? Was the dire agenda of the large blue. Where shall we breed? Please tell me, and how? Our flourish pastures are under the plough. The marshmallow moth was the next to complain. Oh, the hedgerows! The hedgerows are going in many a lane. And what shall I do? Cried the old brown hair streak. My home was torn down. I barely can speak. The dark bordered beauty shed a few tears. New housing and industry is what we fear. The Barbary carpet was also bereft. We have only 9 breeding sites left. The large tortoiseshell said, it's a disgrace. Time was I was seen in many a place. Oh, me too, said the strawbell, the rare grassland moth. We fell to the farmer, his blade and his wrath. The dark copper spoke of the bad schemes of men, and the black-veined moth of the drainage of fens. The dark crimson underwing wondered who might take on the moth's and the butterfly's plight.
That's the kind of poem that inspires a kind of, a sadness and want to do anything, to do something about this, to protect the butterflies or whatever else it is that your poems are about. So how do you then translate that message into action? Do you have poems that get people to try and do something about it?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm working with children, often what we do is that I try and find out the issues that they are concerned about. Show them how they can express those issues through the power of poetry. And that might involve using particular poetry structures. A book that I've recently written, which is a collection of poetry called Invertebrates, not invertebrates, but Invertebrates. The book is all about invertebrates. All the poems are about invertebrates, but told through verse. Now, each of those poems in the book teaches you how to write a poem in a particular structure. So if you had to write a Kyrielle or a ballad or a Kennin or a Clerihew, this book just shows you how to do it very, very simply. Now, that's what I try and do with children in the workshop, and indeed with adults as well. I mean, in India, I've worked with workshops 8 to 80, actually. And so they learn their little structure, they write their message down that they want to communicate about the eco concerns that we have. And then often what we do is that if there is an item that is associated with that, let's say plastics, then I get them to come in with plastic. So they come in with plastic trays, plastic bottles, any old bits of plastic. Or it might be litter. If they're concerned about litter, they come in with litter, whatever it is. And we write the material on that. So, for instance, I've written on plastic bags, plastic bottles. I don't know whether, yeah, here we are. Plastic bottles. It's a poem about plastic bottles called Bottle Billions. And skateboards, old skateboards. I've written on my transport poems on old skateboards. And the children do that too. And they've written on such amazing things, where we've got some, children writing on bottles here, and maybe there's another one, please. Yeah, somebody's written on plant pots, somebody's written on banana skins, somebody's written on their thing was landfill, all the nappies that were going to landfill, so they wrote their poetry on the nappy. And then what we do is that we then have a major exhibition, if we can, of all those artifacts, all the poetry on those artifacts. And I feel that this is kind of like, for them, it's a more potent way, again, of expressing the message. So I've done that quite a bit. This one was in Devon, but I've done it all around the UK, in China a couple of years ago, and I say there's quite a lot in India, and it does engage and it does communicate, and I think it's just another way of the power of poetry getting across.
It's incredible. So for the people here today who may not have written any poetry since school, I know I certainly haven't, where would you suggest they start? How can people write their own green poems?
Well, of course, read poetry, but I would say, a lot of people, all my verse is mainly rhyming poetry. But I would say, go back to some of the traditional forms, which are absolutely, I said to you that, I have really no great science background to speak of, but I am really interested in science, and I'm really interested in, even though I have no maths background, I've got a superb mental arithmetic faculty, and I'm absolutely super interested in how mathematical poetry structures work. So I had to write a poem. I gave myself the challenge of writing a Renegade More, which is an Irish poem, Irish form of poetry. And it had so many rules in it, but it was beautiful. You had to kind of have rhymes, but you also had to have internal cross rhymes, and the first word used to have to rhyme with the final word of the poem, and there used to have to be hidden alliteration in each line of the poem, and the preceding word to the end word of each poem had to have an alliterative device built into it as well. And there were so many rules, but it's just like doing some really sophisticated puzzle or sum, and I just absolutely love it. And so I would just kind of test myself again, all the different forms of poetry. Could I do it? How could I do it? Would it work? And I eventually then invented, at the end of the book, of that book, Invertebrate, I invent one of my own forms, which is called a sprime, a kind of a portmanteau word, partly meaning spine and partly meaning rhyme, a sprime. And you have to write the poem in conventional lines, and you can rhyme it if you like, but you have to have the title of the poem, the subject of the poem, must run as a spine right through the center of the poem. So it's a real conundrum of really, how can you fit letters preceding and post that letter in each of the vertical word in the horizontal lines?
Well, so
love it.
Yeah, because you have quite an analytical mind as well as what we might think of as creative mind, which are usually thought of these two sides, right? Science is analytical and poetry is creative. And I think that's the perfect theme for our day, mixing art and science. So do you really see yourself at that intersection of art and science?
Well, Hayley, I'd love to think I was at that intersection, but as I say, it's just my love of science. I just feel ashamed that my brain, my neural capacity just wasn't good enough to really understand the intricacies of some of the things I needed to understand. But when I was, having said that, when I became a composer, and I mainly composed for the orchestra. So all the wildlife films I did with a lot of them with Sir David Attenborough, and a lot of them with the biologist who you will know, Desmond Morris, who wrote The Naked Ape. A lot of those scores were for symphony orchestra. But initially, my training was in electronic music. So back in the early 80s, I was having to know about things like Ohm's law of acoustics, and I was working with the old, what were then VCS3 synthesizers. which means you had three oscillators, one which you could move up and down, you could choose a sine wave, a sawtooth wave, or a square wave, and you used to then combine those waves or give a control voltage from another oscillator to control one of those oscillators, and so on. And we use all sorts of things, filtering and ring modulation. And so I had to teach myself a lot about electronics and a little bit about physics at that time. It wasn't easy going. But anyway, that's the enjoyment I get out of it. And my mentor, in fact, was the same. He was somebody that was really self-taught in physics, for example. So I think I just followed his example.
That's always one way to do it. I have 3 master's degrees and I still don't understand any of that stuff. So, it's all about what you know. I think this is a good time then to open it up to questions. So in the audience, do we have any questions? Oh, right in the front here. Just if you give it a second, well, the boom mic comes to you. I'll just check the online form as well.
Hello. Does the phrase "poets against the bomb" mean anything to you? Ring any?
Poets against the bomb.
Does it ring a bell?
It rings a bell, but I don't know anything about Poets Against the Bomb.
In the 70s, I think, the Ban the Bomb movement climaxed in the Test Ban Treaty, and there were actually movement in political life. And just before that, the climax of opposition to just make bombs, do what you like. The climax of the opposition was, as you have said, poets. They are the ones who. So they organised a poetry reading somewhere in London, and the most eminent poets of the day turned up and read anti-nuclear poems, and the event was called Poets Against the Bomb, and I had the honor to film it. And that's it. About in the 70s.
Yeah, amazing. I think, it's good to hear about that. Thank you. And again, to me, I'm just fascinated with what is it about poets, though? Is it the fact that we're kind of on some kind of societal wasteland, and they just think, we need somebody to complain about this. Let's get some poets. But what I truly believe is that it is because we are able to distill a message, and we're prepared to stand out to do it.
From a scientific point of view, I would say that the main distinguishing feature of the evolutionary thread that leads to human beings is speech, the power of speech, and afterwards rational speech. And poetry goes right to the heart of irrational and irrational speech, and it's the same. Animals don't have poetry because they don't have speech. So I think that the evolutionary path has led through speech to poetry as the greatest culmination.
It's interesting because when you look at the romantic poets, you've got Coleridge, who was very much about logic, and learning and reason, But then you've got Keats. He had this thing called negative capability, which he said, you can dislodge yourself from the reason, from that, and you can move on from the fancy speech and so on, and you've just got to kind of put yourself into. The poet must put themselves into a world of uncertainty. That's what Keats advises one to do, and he calls it negative capability. So that's where the flow comes from. Really interesting.
There you go. So you're the pinnacle of evolution, we've learned today.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? I think there was one down here at the front.
Hi, Martin. That's all been really interesting. As a poet myself, I know that sometimes some words are almost impossible to rhyme. So my question to you is, what is your proudest rhyming couplet that you've managed to achieve?
My proudest rhyme.
Yes, or rhyming couplet that you've managed to achieve.
Oh dear. Oh. Well, it's such a difficult thing to answer. What is my favourite one? Well, I think it would have to be this poem that I was telling you about in my poop hour. Let me do the poop hour one for you, because really all the rhymes in it you can join in as well. It's really all that poem, really, because it does all the stuff for me in terms of getting the rhymes across, but allowing the audience. I like inviting the audience. So some of the most successful rhymes for me are the ones where the audience can anticipate what it is that you're going to rhyme with and join in. So making your own. Making your own energy from animal poop power. Okay, in England's green and pleasant land, find a field that's close at hand. Choose a cud-chewing herd of cows that has no toilet training vows. Wait until they've finished tea, collect their dung and all their pee. Probably that line. Stick the cow pats in a tank. Hold your breath, because it smells rank. Put a lid on firm and tight. Stir the slurry every night. Heat it up to 55 degrees until well curdled and sludgy. Whistle, a time-passing sweet refrain as bacterial bugs create
Methane.
which, as you know, is biogas your cows have made from eating. So now you've solved the mooted question of anaerobic tank digestion. A fancy name for making fuel, not from crude oil, but from a poo. So entertain your friends for hours, turning poo into power.
Hey.
So that's one that kids all around the world, they love that poem, and especially in schools. But after I've done my performance in schools and I go away, teachers always say to me, I wish you'd never come to teach that poo power, because all they do is they go around the corridors going the poo power salute to us for months afterwards.
That was a good one. Okay, any other questions in the audience here? Yep, there's one on the side here. Sorry, making the boom guy do a lot of work today. That's all good.
Hi, hello. Really good talk, thank you. My question is, as well as kind of writing these poems for an educational purpose, do you find it quite cathartic as well? Because I know, like, sometimes when you can read headlines, like, you just get really angry. So I feel like, is it, a good form of, catharsis, I guess. Yeah.
It is cathartic. It's very important to get that out, I feel, onto paper or into performance. At the earlier performance today at the Royal Albert Hall, somebody came up to me afterwards and said that their daughter was really having a lot of difficulty with, emotionally, with all the stuff that is going on, that we have to think about in terms of how we're going to have, proper stewardship of using all the eco things we want to do to save the planet. So she said, what can you do? What can you advise? And one of the things I did say is that it is about writing it down. It is about, to some extent, as I say, having an eco chuckle now and again, because it diffuses the seriousness of it for sure, but it also gets the message across and it helps you to get it out. But I think, yes, I think absolutely right. It is cathartic. It helps you to put it down on paper, helps you to kind of structure your thoughts, and hopefully then that can help other people as well. So absolutely, absolutely right.
Hi.
Hello.
So I'm also a poet, and following up from the last question, is there any poem that you've had something unconventional in? So like one of the poems I wrote, I included a knock-knock joke in it. So is there something unconventional you've done with your poems that you'd like to share?
I missed a little bit of that. Sorry, can you say it?
Okay, so I'm also a poet, and in one of my poems, I included a knock-knock joke. So that's something very unconventional, and you don't really find that in poems. So is there something that you've done in yours to make it seem more interesting or engage audience?
Something that I've done that makes it more interesting to engage an audience.
And something that's not usually seen, yeah.
That's not usually seen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a few poems that I use. Well, one of the poems that I use a football in that is made by children in Africa when they can't afford to buy a football or get one from anywhere. They make it out of plastic bags, rolling them together and tying them up and so on and so forth. And that inspired me to write a poem about the world as a football. So in this particular poem, that's really how it goes. So So the unconventional thing would be finding something that can be introduced in the poem that is a metaphor really. But it is a challenge, isn't it? It is a challenge, but that's one of the poems I've done where I think I have introduced something unconventional into the material.
Thank you. Yeah, I think was there a question here that you still had? Yeah. While we go to him, I remember what I wanted to ask you earlier when she was talking about rhymes. Have you ever rhymed anything with orange?
No, well, I've never had to use the word orange so far, so I've been
There's
lucky.
the next challenge. Sorry, carry on. Here, this guy on the side there.
But the thing is, just Hayley, just to say, is that I love making up words. So orange actually wouldn't faze me, because I believe in neologism. I love inventing new words. So a lot of the words that I sometimes use when I'm working with children and we're looking at double dactylic words, for example, 6-syllabic words, I'm coming up with words like awesome, tremendous, wow, fab, superical, spec, stupentacular, briltastic, oracle, and I have a whole list of words that I tend to use. And so often if we are writing, there is a form of poetry called the double dactyl, and there's one line in which you have to write a double dactylic word, a 6-syllable word. So I have a list of 6-syllable words that can help them, but I say to them, look, don't get fazed by it, just make up your own word, and that's all part of poetry as well. And that's, as you said, that's one great way of bringing unconventionality into your poetry. Use new words.
Yes, Thomas Hardy used to do that, didn't he, Martin? My question is, you're a brilliant musician as well as a poet. Have you thought about writing any music to your poems?
Well, we did do a performance in Bristol, at what is now the Bristol Beacon, some years ago, of the Green poems backed by small orchestra. It was such an expensive and elaborate thing to do that to find a sponsor again to get involved with that kind of thing, very difficult. Were lovely to do, for sure, because a lot of the time my poetry work has been separate from my music work. When I've done my poetry work on stage, I never introduced music into the set. But that, as I say, that doesn't say that there aren't things that I would like to do where I do introduce music. So, for example, when I wrote the King Frank and the Knights of the Ecoquest, and we adapted it for radio, I wrote a 150-minute score that accompanied the series all the way through. What I want to do is I want to do a bit like the Goons used to do. When you see those shows when they're filmed doing their radio set with their scripts. I want to set it up as a live radio performance. And in that scenario, I would get children to do live music as the radio play is also being performed live as well.
Yes, I was thinking like with well-known nursery rhymes, there's normally a tune that goes with them, and they stick in our minds.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I haven't got there yet, but perhaps that will be on the list.
One last quick question down the front.
Can I just follow that up with, because there's a piece of music called the Great Mississippi and the Lake Titicaca, which is for four voices. It's an absolute nightmare to learn. And it's got Brindisi and various other things. And there is a musicality to the words themselves. Do you think there's something in the Martin Kishko brain that is that music and poetry actually have a kind of emotional, creative heart that is actually beating to the same heartbeat? Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, I think that definitely when I'm creating poems, it's not even conscious, but it's a subconscious, because music has been my life. You know, I spent 40 years composing music, and it comes through my choices of words. You know, do I choose a word which has got 4 syllables, 2 syllables? You know, will it have lots of consonants in it? Will it not have lots of consonants in it? All those are, for me, very similar to choices that I make when I'm orchestrating. You know, what kind of colours do I use for words? Therefore, what kind of timbres, colours do I use for orchestral instruments? You know, should the trumpet come in here? You know, should this word come in here, or is it too bright against this particular word, or do I want it to be like that, just like I have the trumpet in the orchestra come in like in that specific way for that effect? So I think it just luckily I think for me it's just second nature when I'm writing. I'm thinking of the rhythms in terms of the meter of the poem. I'm thinking about the coloration. I'm thinking about the durational values of the words as well.
Thank you so much. Now, unfortunately, I think that is all we have time for today. So thank you so much, Martin, for sharing your stories. I think this has been a fascinating hour. I'm sure you all agree. So thank you to everyone who's joined us for the Great Exhibition Road Festival, both in person and online. If you've enjoyed this event, do check out our other events throughout the week and follow us on our social channels. If we were unable to get your questions today, apologies, but this talk will be available, I think, immediately afterwards on the YouTube channel, so you can watch again or share with your friends and family. We'd also love to hear what you think. So if you're in the room, there's a QR code up here, and I think there's some on some of the tables. And on YouTube, there'll be a link posted to an evaluation form. It only takes about 5 minutes. It's really important to us, and you can win a £50 shopping voucher, so it's a win-win for everyone. Right?
I should have done my shopping poem.
Oh, yeah. Consumerism, what are you going to do? But otherwise, it just remains for me to thank Martin so much for his wonderful talk, for everyone who came along, and to wish you a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Great gratitude. Thank you.